Hey guys, tonight we're buckling in for something gloriously, painfully American. The 1950s road trip. Not the Instagram version, not the romanticised Route 66 poster with the convertible and the perfectly windswept hair. I mean the real thing. The back sweat, the crying children, the gas station bathroom that looked like it had been through a war, and the blistering highway that stretched on forever like a punishment from God himself. So before we peel out of the driveway, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And hey, if you've been catching these episodes on Spotify, the link is down in the description. Feel free to drift off there too. Now dim those lights, throw on a fan for that soft white noise, and go ahead and get yourself horizontal. Let's pause for a moment. Have you ever wondered what it was actually like to pile your entire family into a £4,000 steel box with no air conditioning and drive it across a country that barely had road signs? What did people eat? Where did they sleep? What happened when the car broke down on a 2-lane highway in the middle of Oklahoma at high noon in July with 3 kids in the back seat and a dog that needed to go? Did anyone enjoy themselves? Or was the 1950s road trip just a form of cheerful, voluntary suffering dressed up in chrome and optimism? Could you have survived a week in a station wagon before the interstate existed, with a map that was already out of date, a husband who refused to stop and ask for directions, and a thermos of lukewarm coffee as your only comfort? And now, congratulations, you've just woken up in the summer of 1954. You're in the back seat of a Chevrolet Bel Air. It is 94 degrees. Someone has already spilled orange soda on the upholstery. The dog is on your lap, and Dad just missed the turn again. Let's talk about the machine at the centre of this whole adventure. The car. Not just any car, the 1950s American car, which was less of a vehicle and more of a philosophical statement on wheels. These things were enormous. We're talking about chrome-plated, fin-tailed, hood ornament-wearing steel behemoths that consumed gasoline the way a medieval peasant consumed despair, constantly and without apology. The Chevrolet Bel Air, the Ford Custom Line, the Buick Roadmaster. These were the chariots of the American family, and they were magnificent in the way that things are magnificent when they are completely impractical. You didn't drive a 1950s car so much as you piloted it, the way you might pilot a small aircraft that smelled faintly of cigarette smoke and vinyl. There was no power steering, there were no seat belts, there was certainly no backup camera. What there was, however, was an instrument panel that looked like the cockpit of a rocket ship, a steering wheel roughly the diameter of a hula hoop, and enough chrome on the exterior to blind oncoming traffic on a sunny afternoon. The interior was a world of its own. Bench seats ran the full width of the car, front and back, upholstered in vinyl that was either cream, turquoise, red, or a shade of brown that the catalogue described as warm mocha, and that everyone else described as brown. In summer, that vinyl became a cooking surface. You did not sit on the seat so much as you bonded with it, physically, chemically, in a way that required real effort to reverse when the time came to get out. The backs of your thighs would peel away from the seat with a sound that was undignified at best. You learned to carry a towel. You learned to slide out carefully. You learned these things after the first time, which taught them to you permanently. The trunk was cavernous, which was good, because you needed cavernous. The 1950s American family did not pack lightly. The trunk swallowed suitcases whole. It could fit a cooler, a set of tools, a spare tyre, which you absolutely needed, and which took up a shocking amount of space, and still leave room for the bag of sports equipment that Dad had insisted on bringing, despite the fact that nobody had used sports equipment on a vacation since 1947. The trunk was a source of constant negotiation and occasional despair. The car had a heater, which worked excellently and was completely irrelevant in July. It had a radio, which worked intermittently and was beloved anyway. It had ashtrays built into the doors, the dashboard, and possibly other locations you hadn't discovered yet, because this was an era in which everyone smoked everywhere without a second thought, including in a sealed vehicle with children in the back seat and a dog of uncertain respiratory health on the floor. The windows were rolled down, the smoke went mostly out. Mostly. What the car did not have was a rear-view camera, cruise, control, a padded dashboard, or any of the dozens of features that modern drivers consider basic equipment. What it had instead was heft, presence, and a sense of occasion. Pulling into a gas station in a 1950s American car was an arrival. Parking it in front of a diner was a statement. Driving it down a 2-lane highway on a summer afternoon with the windows down and the radio crackling was, whatever else happened before or after, one of the finest feelings that decade had to offer. The car was not just transportation. It was the container of the entire experience, the arguments, the laughter, the heat, the boredom, the wonder. Everything that happened on the road trip happened inside it, or because of it. It was your home for 2 weeks, your prison on the long days, and your chariot on the good ones. And on the good ones, there was nothing better. Before a single suitcase was packed, or a single gas tank filled, the 1950s road trip began with a ritual, the consulting of the map. Not a GPS, not a satellite. A paper map folded into a rectangle the size of a paperback novel, and then, crucially, never successfully refolded again for the rest of its natural life. These maps were provided by gas stations, by AAA, and occasionally by well-meaning relatives who had driven to Florida in 1948 and were very confident the roads were exactly the same now. Planning a road trip in the 1950s was an exercise in cheerful delusion. You'd spread the map across the kitchen table, trace a line with your finger from here to there, calculate the mileage based on nothing more than hope and a rough sense of how fast the car went, and announce to your family that you'd be in the mountains by Thursday. Reader, you would not be in the mountains by Thursday. The map itself was a beautiful object, a large sheet of paper printed in colours that had been selected to be informative and had wound up being decorative, blue for water, green for parks, red for major highways, thin black lines for the secondary roads that would become central to your journey in ways you'd not anticipated. The AAA also produced something called a triptych, which was a customised spiral-bound booklet showing your route page by page. This was considered the height of road trip sophistication. You filled out a form, mailed it in, and received back a little book that told you exactly where to go. What it could not tell you was what would happen when the bridge on page 7 was closed for construction, or when the town on page 12 had moved its main road without consulting the cartographers. Planning sessions happened at the kitchen table after dinner, with the map spread wide and a cup of coffee getting cold at Dad's elbow. There were questions. How far could you drive in a day? Somewhere between 200 and 300 miles was the optimistic answer, which did not account for stops, for traffic, for the car needing water, for the children needing bathrooms, or for the scenic detour that Mum had read about in a magazine and very much wanted to see. The honest answer was, you would drive as far as you drove, and you would stop when you had to stop, and you would not know where that was until you got there. Destinations were chosen from a short list of American landmarks that had achieved a kind of mythological status in the post-war era. Florida, California, the national parks, Yellowstone, the Grand Canyon, the Smoky Mountains, Washington, D.C., for the families who felt the trip should be educational, the lake where the cousins had a cabin, for the families who had cousins with cabins and knew better than to look a gift weak in the face. Each destination came with its own promises and its own delusions. Florida meant beaches and sunshine and oranges fresh from the tree. California meant everything, the Pacific, the palm trees, the sense that you had driven all the way to the edge of the country and there was nothing left but ocean. The national parks meant America itself, raw and ancient and completely indifferent to your schedule. The planning was, in some ways, the best part, the part where the trip was still perfect, still on time, still exactly what everyone hoped it would be. Then the day came, the car was loaded, the map was folded incorrectly for the first time, and the glorious, messy reality of actually going began. Loading the family car for a road trip in the 1950s was not a casual activity. It was an event, a multi-hour production involving strategic debate, marital tension, and at least one argument about whether the electric fan was really necessary. Because here is the thing. The car had a trunk, and the trunk was a fixed size, and the amount of luggage an American family intended to bring on a 2-week vacation was absolutely not a fixed size. Suitcases were heavy, hard-sided, and roughly the shape of a small refrigerator. There were no rolling wheels on the bottom. You simply lifted them, strained something in your lower back and hoped for the best. Blankets, pillows, a cooler full of sandwiches and glass bottles of Coca-Cola, a bag of toys for the children, a bag of tools for the car because you would absolutely need them, a thermos, a rain jacket, a box of crackers, a road atlas, and the dog. All of it had to go somewhere. What didn't fit in the trunk went on the roof, strapped down with bungee cords and the sincerest prayers your family had ever offered. The suitcase situation alone was a negotiation of some complexity. Every member of the family had been told, clearly and in advance, that they were allowed one suitcase. This instruction had been heard and understood, and then interpreted generously by everyone involved. The children each had a suitcase and a separate bag for toys, books, and the comfort objects, without which the trip would be emotionally impossible. Mum had one large suitcase and a smaller bag and a hat box, because hats required a hat box, and if you suggested otherwise, you had not thought carefully about what you were suggesting. Dad had one suitcase, which was the smallest suitcase, because Dad prided himself on packing efficiently, and also because everything else had already been allocated. The packing of the trunk was Dad's domain, and he approached it with the focus and spatial reasoning of a man who believed deeply in the existence of a correct answer. Suitcases went in first, heaviest at the bottom, longest against the back. The cooler went in on its side or in the back seat, depending on how the suitcases fell. The tools went in a corner, wrapped in a rag. The spare tyre was already there, immovable, taking up its corner of the trunk with the quiet authority of something that knew it was indispensable. The bags of miscellaneous items, the toys, the rain jackets, the extra blankets, were compressed and wedged into the remaining spaces with the persistence of someone who was not going to make a second trip. Things went on the roof. A trunk rack bolted to the car's luggage rails held additional bags, which were covered with a canvas tarpaulin and secured with straps that were tightened with great confidence and then checked again twice, because what if they weren't tight enough? On the highway, these roof-mounted items created a low, satisfying hum of wind resistance. Occasionally at high speed, something would shift, and there would be a thump, and Dad would grip the wheel tighter without commenting, and nobody in the car would say a word. The loading process took the morning. There was always something left, always a last item that someone had forgotten, discovered at the bottom of the stairs while everyone was already in the car. It was repacked in. The trunk was closed again, requiring some effort. The family settled into their seats, the dog found its corner, and after all of it, the planning and the arguing and the packing and the repacking, the car backed out of the driveway, and the trip began. Dad had decreed that the family would leave at 5 in the morning. This was non-negotiable. The logic was airtight. Leave early, beat the traffic, make good time, be there by dinner. In theory, this was a reasonable plan. In practice, it required everyone in the household to be awake, dressed, fed and loaded into the vehicle by 5 a.m. And if you have ever tried to get a 7-year-old, a 4-year-old and a Cocker Spaniel all pointed in the same direction before the sun rises, you already understand why the family did not leave at 5 a.m. They left at 7:45, and Dad spent the first 2 hours of the drive in a state of quiet, simmering frustration, recalculating in his head exactly how much time had been lost, muttering occasionally about the traffic that was now, as he had predicted, terrible. The morning had begun well enough. The alarm had gone off at 4:30, which was early enough to be offensive. Dad was up. Immediately, the way men of that generation were up immediately. Vertical and purposeful, within seconds, as though waking up was a thing you either committed to or didn't. He was dressed, he was downstairs, he had the coffee on. He had even carried 2 suitcases to the car already by the time Mom came downstairs at 4:45, moving at a pace that suggested she had a different relationship with the concept of 5 a.m. The children were the variable. The children had been told the night before that they needed to be dressed and ready with their shoes on by 4:45. One of them had interpreted this as permission to sleep until 4:45 and then get dressed, which was technically correct but operationally disastrous. The other had gotten up voluntarily at 4 in the morning, full of energy, asking questions. By 5:30, the energetic one was limp with exhaustion. The reluctant one was still looking for a shoe, and the dog had disappeared into the backyard and was resisting all efforts at retrieval. Then there were the last-minute discoveries. The thermos, which had been packed, was located empty. Someone had drunk from it yesterday and not refilled it, and not mentioned this. The thermos was filled. The camera had no film, which was discovered when someone went to take a photograph of the family in front of the loaded car and found the back of the camera empty. Film was located in a drawer. The camera was loaded. A photograph was taken. It would come back from the drugstore 2 weeks later, slightly overexposed, everyone squinting in the early morning light, the car behind them listing slightly from the weight of the roof rack. The actual departure, when it finally came, was accompanied by a feeling that was part relief and part ceremony. The house was locked. The neighbours had been asked to collect the mail. The stove had been checked twice. Everyone was in the car, children, dog, thermos full of coffee, camera with film, map, incorrectly folded on the front seat, and Dad backed out of the driveway and pointed the car toward the highway. Whatever happened next, you were going. The day was already warm. The traffic was exactly as bad as Dad had predicted. The children began asking if they were there yet before you had cleared the town limits, and it was, despite everything, the beginning of something. Here is something worth understanding about driving across America in the early 1950s. The interstate highway system did not exist yet. It wouldn't be signed into law until 1956, which means that for most of this era, a cross-country road trip meant navigating a patchwork quilt of state highways, county roads, 2-lane blacktop stretches, and the occasional gravel detour that the map had optimistically labelled a route. These roads were not bad exactly. They were just honest. Honest about the fact that America was a very large country, and no one had quite gotten around to connecting all of it properly yet. You might sail through a modern downtown Main Street, stop at every traffic light for 20 minutes, and then emerge onto a lonely stretch of 2-lane highway flanked by cornfields that went on until the curvature of the earth made them disappear. The highway numbers were confusing by design, or at least they felt that way. US Route 1 ran up the East Coast. US Route 66 ran from Chicago to Los Angeles. US Route 40 cut across the middle of the country in a way that made sense on a map and considerably less sense once you were on it. State routes had their own numbering systems, which overlapped with the federal routes in ways that required careful attention. You could be on US 40 and State Route 17 simultaneously, which sounded like a contradiction and was, in practice, just how roads worked. Signs were not always present. Signs that were present were not always legible. Signs that were legible were not always correct because they had been placed years ago and the road had changed in the interim. The two-lane road was the fundamental unit of 1950s travel, and it had a personality of its own. 2 lanes meant that you were sharing the road with oncoming traffic at a distance of about 12 feet, which sounds terrifying and became, after a few hours, simply normal. Passing was possible on straightaways, when you could see far enough ahead to be confident. It required pulling into the oncoming lane, accelerating past the vehicle in front of you, usually a truck, always slower than you wanted it to be, and returning to your lane with what you hoped was adequate margin. This manoeuvre was performed dozens of times a day, by everyone, without particular drama. It was just how driving worked before the divided highway arrived to make it unnecessary. In towns, the highway became Main Street. You stopped at stoplights. You waited for a train to cross. You drove past hardware stores and five and dimes and diners and gas stations at the legal speed of 25 miles per hour, and everyone in the car looked out the window at the town. This town they were passing through, whose name they had seen on the map and would never see again, and formed brief impressions about what it would be like to live there before the town ended and the highway resumed. The roads were being built even as you drove them. Sections of the country were connected that had not been connected the year before. Bypasses were under construction around cities that had previously required you to drive through their downtowns. In some places, you could see the new road being graded beside the old one, the raw earth turned up, the machinery still running, America literally building itself toward the future as you drove past. By 1956, when Eisenhower signed the Federal Aid Highway Act, the Great Transformation would be official. But in these years just before, the road was still human-scaled, still intertwined with the towns it passed through, still a thing you experienced up close rather than above and apart from. That intimacy cost you time. It gave you everything else. Every road trip in the 1950s revolved, in ways both practical and spiritual, around the gas station. Not the sad, fluorescent, convenience store hybrid you pull into today to buy an energy drink and argue with a card reader. The 1950s gas station was something else entirely. A full-service operation staffed by actual human beings who came running out to meet your car before you'd even fully stopped. A man in a uniform, a man with a name patch, a man who would pump your gas, check your oil, clean every single window on your vehicle with a squeegee, and check your tyre pressure, all without being asked, and all for the privilege of selling you a few gallons of gasoline that cost about 25 cents each. It was, by any reasonable standard, extraordinary, and you sat in the car like royalty while it all happened around you. The gas stations were branded and distinctive. Sinclair had the green dinosaur, which the children adored. Shell had the Shell. Standard Oil, Texaco, Gulf, each had its colours and its logo and its uniforms, and along the major highways they appeared at intervals that were designed to ensure you never ran dry, as long as you were paying attention to the gauge and had not, as occasionally happened, miscalculated the distance to the next town. The buildings were low and clean, usually painted white, with a canopy over the pump islands and a service bay where actual mechanical work was performed by actual mechanics who knew what they were looking at under a hood. You pulled in. The bell rang. That specific, wonderful 2-note ding-ding of the air hose stretched across the drive, announcing your arrival. The attendant appeared. What'll it be? Fill it up, regular. And then the performance began. The gas nozzle went in. The attendant went to the windshield to the back, window to both side windows with a squeegee and a rag, working efficiently and leaving glass so clean it was briefly disorienting. He checked the oil without being asked. He might check the radiator level. He might glance at the tyres. He had opinions about tyres and was willing to share them if you seemed receptive. If you had a problem with the car, a noise, a shimmy, a smell that had begun outside of Tulsa and hadn't gone away, this was where you mentioned it. The service bay would swallow your car for 20 minutes or 2 hours, depending on what the problem turned out to be. You waited in a chair inside the office, which smelled of motor oil, and had a rack of road maps and a Coca-Cola machine that dispensed glass bottles for a nickel. The children, if they were with you, looked at the maps. They drank Coca-Cola. They asked the attendant questions that he answered with complete seriousness, because that was how adults treated children's questions in the 1950s, as legitimate inquiries deserving real answers. The gas station was also an information exchange. The attendant knew the roads. He knew which ones were under construction, which ones had bad stretches, where the speed traps were, which towns had decent diners, and which were best passed through quickly. He was a node in the informal network of road knowledge that existed before anyone thought to write it down or put it in an app. You thanked him, you tipped him if you were the tipping type, and you drove away with clean windows and a full tank and a slightly better sense of what was ahead. The next gas station would be 40 miles down the road. You'd see it coming from a long way off. Let us turn our attention now to the people in the back seat, the children, the small, loud, restless, endlessly hungry creatures who'd been loaded into the car with great optimism and who had begun asking, "Are we there yet?" approximately 11 minutes after departure. The 1950s had no screens, no tablets, no portable video players, no noise-cancelling headphones. What children had on a road trip was the window, each other, and an almost supernatural capacity for boredom that expressed itself in creative and deeply annoying ways. They fought over the invisible line down the middle of the seat. They poked each other. They sang the same 4 lines of the same song 40 times in a row. They announced that they needed to use the bathroom approximately 7 minutes after the last bathroom stop, and they meant it, and there was no arguing with them about it. The games helped to a point. License plate bingo was a classic. You found a bingo card printed in a magazine or drew one yourself, and you called out license plates from other states as they appeared. This worked well through Kansas, where plates from neighbouring states were common. It worked less well in the middle of Wyoming, where you might go 40 minutes between out-of-state plates, and the children's attention span did not support 40 minutes of watching and waiting. The alphabet game, find each letter of the alphabet in sequence on signs and buildings along the road, was another option, one that created intense competition and occasional accusations of cheating so heated they required parental intervention. You could always count cows, you could always spot a barn, you could always play the quiet game, which lasted an average of 90 seconds. The snack situation was carefully managed. Mum had packed snacks, crackers, fruit, cookies, the kind of things that could be eaten without utensils and that would not destroy the upholstery. These were rationed. You did not simply open the snack bag and let the children access it freely, because if you did, the snacks would be gone by the time you cleared the state line, and you would have nothing for the 300 miles after that. Snacks were dispensed at intervals, as rewards for good behaviour or as crisis management tools when behaviour had deteriorated past a certain threshold. A cookie at the right moment could reset the back seat entirely. This was not bribery. This was strategy. The invisible line was a serious matter. Every family with multiple children in a car understood the invisible line, the theoretical boundary down the exact centre of the back seat, on either side of which each child had sovereign territory and rights, and across which no toy, elbow, foot, or influence of any kind was permitted to cross without consent. This line was constantly being disputed. It shifted. It was expanded by one party, contested by the other. It was the subject of grievances delivered to the front seat in a tone that suggested injustice of a historical scale. Dad's responses to these grievances, delivered without turning around, range from "work it out" to "don't make me stop this car," a threat of unclear consequences that nevertheless carried genuine weight. By late afternoon, exhaustion arrived like weather. The fighting would slow. Someone would fall asleep against the window, cheek pressed to glass, breath fogging a small circle. The other would follow, tipped sideways, one arm on the dog. The back seat, which had been a battlefield for 6 hours, became quiet. The radio played softly. The road stretched ahead. Mum looked at the sleeping children in the rearview mirror, and something in her expression softened. And Dad drove on, and the car moved through the late light of a summer afternoon toward wherever they were spending the night. Eating on a 1950s road trip was a layered experience, and the layers went roughly like this. The sandwiches Mum packed, the diner where Dad stopped for lunch, the roadside stand that sold something unidentifiable but irresistible, and the gas station crackers consumed in desperation somewhere around 3 in the afternoon. The sandwiches came in wax paper and lived in the cooler, which was an actual cooler, an insulated box packed with actual blocks of ice, from the Iceman or from a gas station at the start of the trip. By day 2, the ice was mostly water, the sandwiches were coldish, and the Coca-Cola bottles were a temperature best described as not warm enough to complain about, but not cold enough to enjoy. You ate them anyway because the alternative was another 40 miles before the next town, and Dad was not stopping. The sandwiches were good. This should be acknowledged. Mum made good sandwiches, substantial, no-nonsense constructions of bread and meat, and maybe mustard, wrapped tightly and stacked with care. Ham and cheese, bologna, peanut butter for the children, which travelled well and required no refrigeration and could double as emergency nutrition at any hour of the day. There were hard-boiled eggs sometimes, peeled and salted in a little paper bag. There were apples. There were cookies in a tin that clicked satisfyingly when it opened, and that everyone helped themselves to with only moderate restraint. The food was plain, and the food was honest, and the food disappeared, because you were driving all day, and driving made you hungry in a way that was impossible to fully anticipate in the kitchen at home the night before. The cooler was a study in thermodynamics and optimism. It started the trip fully iced and tightly packed. By day 3 it was a cold lake at the bottom, and a pile of damp wax paper on top, and whatever hadn't been eaten yet resting in a way that was technically still acceptable and practically a little concerning. Nobody got sick, or if they did, they attributed it to the heat. The ice situation was addressed at gas stations, where you could buy a bag of ice and repack the cooler in the parking lot, a process that was unglamorous but effective and that gave the children something to do for 7 minutes. The roadside stand appeared without warning. A hand-painted sign on a post, peaches, tomatoes, boiled peanuts, honey, fresh corn. You did not always stop. When you did stop, it was because someone in the car had said something the moment the sign appeared, quick, quiet, not quite a request, but clearly an expression of interest. And Dad had registered it and checked the mirrors and pulled over. The stand was run by a person, usually a single person, sometimes elderly, sometimes a teenager, sitting in the shade with a table of produce and a cash box and no interest in small talk unless you initiated it. You bought something. It was good. It was better than good. It was the best peach you had ever eaten, standing in a gravel pullout somewhere in Georgia in the afternoon heat, the juice running down your wrist. By the time you found a diner for dinner, you were ready for a table and a menu and food that arrived warm on a plate. The diner was the reward for the day. Whatever had happened, the miles, the heat, the squabbling, the wrong turns, you had earned the right to sit in a booth and order something from a laminated menu and be served by a person who called you honey and refilled your coffee without being asked. The pie came last. You had not intended to order pie. You ordered pie. It was always worth it. You left a good tip. You walked back to the car. The evening air was slightly cooler, and you were still 100 miles from the motel. Somewhere around noon, Dad would spot a diner, and the entire atmosphere in the car would shift. The children would stop fighting. The dog would lift its head. Mum would fold her hands in her lap with the patient satisfaction of someone who had known all along that this moment was coming. The American roadside diner of the 1950s was not merely a restaurant. It was a destination, a reward, a fully functioning monument to the belief that a hot cup of coffee and a slice of pie could fix almost anything. They were everywhere along the main highways, long, low buildings with chrome trim and neon signs in the window, the names painted in fat, cheerful letters: Mel's, the Blue Moon, Dots, the Oasis. Inside, it smelled like bacon and coffee and something faintly sweet that you could never quite identify, but that instantly made you feel that everything was going to be fine. The parking lot told you everything you needed to know. A diner with trucks in the lot was a good diner. Truck drivers, who ate on the road for a living and had strong opinions about value and portion size, were reliable arbiters of quality. A parking lot full of trucks at noon meant the food was hot, the portions were large, the coffee was strong, and the price was fair. You parked and went in. The screen door swung shut behind you with its particular sound, a light bang, a rattle, the slap of the rubber gasket, and you were inside. The counter ran along one wall, a long sweep of formica with round stools that spun and were immediately deployed by the children for their intended purpose, and also for the secondary, unauthorized purpose of spinning as fast as possible and seeing how long the dizziness lasted. Booths lined the opposite wall, upholstered in red or green vinyl, each with a small tabletop jukebox that played a song for a nickel. You flipped through the pages of the jukebox selections with genuine interest. You might play something, you might not. You were there for the food, but the jukebox was part of the atmosphere the way the neon sign was part of the atmosphere. It was the texture of the place, the thing that made it itself. The menu was laminated and comprehensive and the same as every other diner menu in the country, and also somehow perfect. Eggs anyway. Pancakes. A hamburger. A hot turkey sandwich on white bread with gravy, which was either exactly what you wanted or the most alarming thing you'd encountered since the state line, depending on where you grew up. Pie was listed at the bottom. Pie was always listed at the bottom, and the list was long. Apple, cherry, peach, coconut cream, lemon meringue, chocolate, and the pie was made in the kitchen of this specific diner by a specific person who had been making it for years and who had opinions about the crust. The waitress was fast and calm and had seen everything. She had seen families road tripping since before the war. She had seen children spill milk on themselves and on the table, and once, memorably, on a stranger in the next booth. She brought extra napkins without being asked. She called you honey without making it feel condescending. She refilled the coffee cup before it was empty, which in the 1950s was considered good service and was, in fact, the highest expression of hospitality available in a roadside diner. You ate. You rested. The children ordered something plain and ate half of it and wanted ice cream, which the diner had, and which you agreed to because the diner had ice cream and you were on vacation, and some things were simply correct. The check came. It was reasonable, absurdly reasonable by any future standard. You left a tip, you filed back out through the screen door into the afternoon heat, and the car was waiting in the sun, hotter than you remembered, and the highway was waiting beyond it, and there were still miles to go. But you were fed, and the coffee had worked, and for the next 50 miles or so, everything seemed entirely manageable. If the diner was the soul of the American road trip, the motel was its body. Its tired, slightly musty, extremely welcome body. The word motel was itself new, a blend of motor and hotel, coined for an era when Americans were driving everywhere and needed somewhere to sleep that didn't require them to park a block away and carry their luggage through a lobby. The motel was built for the car. You pulled right up. The door of your room was 10 feet from your bumper, and nobody needed to carry anything very far or very long. This was revolutionary. In the early 1950s, Motor courts and tourist cabins were giving way to proper motels, tidy rows of rooms with carports attached, a small office up front with a buzzing vacancy sign, and a swimming pool out back that the children had been asking about since Pennsylvania. The motel office was where you began. You parked in front, you went inside, you spoke with the owner or the manager, often the same person who lived in the attached apartment and was watching television when you arrived. The rate was quoted. It was somewhere between $3 and $8 a night for a double room, which felt reasonable given that it included the room, the parking, and whatever version of welcome the proprietor was inclined to offer. Some motels were warm and friendly, some were businesslike. The best ones had a little rack of local brochures by the door, things to see, places to eat, attractions within driving distance, and the owner had opinions about which ones were worth your time and which ones you could safely skip. You signed the register. This was a physical book in which you wrote your name, your home, address, and your license plate number. The register was a record of everyone who had passed through, families from Ohio and Texas and New York and California, a continuous parade of American mobility written in different hands. You were handed a key, a real metal key on a large plastic tag with the room number stamped on it, large enough that you could not accidentally put it in your pocket and drive away without noticing. The room was at the end of a covered walkway or directly facing the parking lot, and you drove around and pulled up in front of your door, which felt both efficient and slightly motel-specific. This specific choreography of car and door and key and room that existed nowhere else. You unloaded what you needed for the night. Not everything. Just the overnight bags and the children's things and the dog's water bowl and the cooler, because even at a motel you wanted the cooler inside rather than in the hot car overnight. This took 2 trips. Inside, the room was exactly what a motel room was supposed to be. Clean, spare, functional, and completely without pretension. It smelled faintly of cleaning solution, and the particular neutral smell of a room that many people had slept in, and none of them had claimed. There was a television bolted to the dresser, which was a genuine luxury, and which the children immediately turned on, and which immediately became the centre of the evening. There was a bathroom with a shower. There was a small bar of soap wrapped in paper. There was a postcard rack on the dresser that you might or might not investigate before bed, and which might or might not result in a postcard being mailed to someone back home from a town you passed through but did not otherwise stay in. The swimming pool was everything the children had been promised. It was cold and blue and small and absolutely sufficient. They swam until dinner, and then they swam a little after dinner, and then they were herded out and towelled off and sent to bed, in the motel room, where they fell asleep almost immediately, having spent themselves completely on the road and the pool, and the sheer overwhelming novelty of a day spent somewhere other than home. There is perhaps no symbol more evocative of the 1950s road trip than the motel vacancy sign, glowing red and green in the gathering dusk, visible from half a mile away, answering the question that had been hanging over the car for the last hour. Would there be a room tonight? This was not a trivial concern. You could not book ahead. There was no internet, no app, no phone number to call from the car. You drove until you needed to stop, and then you stopped and hoped. Dad would slow the car as you approached a motel, both of you squinting at the sign. Vacancy. The word of mercy. No vacancy. The word of doom, meaning you kept driving into the dark, the children wailing softly in the back, the dog restless, Mum saying nothing with a quality of silence that communicated everything. The decision about when to stop was one of the quiet tensions of the road trip, negotiated differently in every family. Dad wanted to make time. Making time was the primary objective, the metric by which the success of the day was measured, and stopping early felt like surrender. Mum wanted to stop before it was desperate, before the children were asleep and had to be carried, before the options narrowed to whatever was left at 9 o'clock on a Friday night in a tourist town in July. These were both reasonable positions, and they were in direct conflict, and the resolution usually arrived not through discussion, but through circumstance. It got late. The children got impossible. The road ahead offered nothing for 30 miles, and the decision made itself. The search for a vacancy could become its own small drama. You might pull into a motel, see the vacancy sign lit, feel the relief of it, park in front of the office, and then be told at the desk that they only had one room left and it was a single and also did not allow pets. You would return to the car with this information. The dog would look at you. You would drive to the next motel. The next motel was full. The next one after that had rooms, but the parking lot smelled wrong, and there was something about the office that Dad did not like, some quality he couldn't name but that he trusted, and so you drove on. The fourth motel had 2 rooms left, and one of them was yours, and you took it with the grateful relief of people who had been driving all day and were done for this particular segment of the adventure. Some nights it went smoothly, you stopped at a reasonable hour. The first motel had rooms, the rate was fair, and you were in bed by 9. Those nights felt like gifts. Other nights it did not go smoothly, and you ended up in a motel that was further down the quality spectrum than you would have chosen under ordinary circumstances. The carpet a little worn, the bathroom a little dim, the television receiving 2 channels, neither of which was anything anyone wanted to watch. You stayed anyway, because it was that or the car, and sleeping in the car was a thing people did in genuine emergencies, and not because they'd driven 30 miles past a perfectly good vacancy sign in the pursuit of a better option. The sign itself became a kind of landmark, a recurring feature of the evening landscape that you scanned automatically after a certain hour, the way you scanned the sky for weather, green for vacancy, unlit or red for full, and sometimes the additional refinement of a smaller sign beneath that said pool or air-conditioned or television, amenities announced like credentials, each one adding a small increment of hope to the proceedings. When you finally saw the right sign at the right time and pulled in, and it all worked out, the feeling was disproportionately satisfying, the way small reliefs always are when you've been driving long enough for them to start feeling large. The motel room of the 1950s was not luxurious. It was not meant to be luxurious. It was meant to be clean, functional, and available, and when it delivered on all 3 of those things, it felt like the greatest room in the world after a day on the road. 2 double beds, a nightstand between them with a lamp, a small dresser with a mirror, a closet with wire hangers, and a bathroom that was barely large enough to turn around in but contained, miraculously, a shower. The bedspread was thin and slightly scratchy and printed with a pattern, abstract shapes, or a floral motif, or something geometric that had seemed modern and optimistic when it was purchased, and now just seemed tired. You did not care. You were horizontal. The road had stopped moving beneath you. This was enough. The first thing everyone did upon entering the motel room was claim territory. The children argued about who got which bed, a negotiation that was urgent and passionate and resolved, eventually by parental decree. The dog made a circuit of the room, nose to the carpet, gathering intelligence about everyone who'd been here before. Mum went directly to the bathroom, assessed it briefly, and began unpacking the toiletry bag with the efficiency of someone who had done this many times and knew exactly what needed to happen before she could feel settled. Dad turned on the television, flipped through the channels. There were 3, sometimes 4, and landed on something that didn't require attention and left it running as background companionship. The bathroom deserved its own moment. After a day in the car, the shower was not a luxury. It was a necessity of the first order, the thing that transformed you from a person who had been driving through summer heat into a person who was reasonably prepared to be horizontal in a bed with sheets. The water pressure in a 1950s motel shower was variable and often surprising. Sometimes it was strong and hot and magnificent. Sometimes it was a dispirited trickle that required patience and strategic positioning. The soap was the small bar wrapped in paper that you'd seen at every motel, a bar so small it seemed designed to be used exactly once and replaced. You used it. It worked. That was the whole point of it. The television was, for the children, the greatest feature of the motel room, better than the pool, which they had already used, better than the beds, which they would use shortly, better than anything else in the room, including the complimentary postcards on the dresser. 1950s television at 9 o'clock at night offered a fairly narrow selection. There might be a western, there might be a variety program, there might be the local news, which was delivered by a man in a suit who spoke with great authority about things happening in a city you were passing through and would never return to. The children watched all of it with equal enthusiasm because it was television, and television was still new enough to be inherently exciting regardless of content. In the morning, the room looked different, smaller, less welcoming, already reabsorbing itself back into anonymity. You packed quickly, checked under the beds for anything dropped, returned the key to the office, and were back in the car before 8. The motel shrunk in the rearview mirror and disappeared, and you carried nothing from it except the particular quality of rest that comes from sleeping somewhere temporary, lighter than home, less encumbered, the way a night on the road always feels when you wake up and remember, with a small surge of something, that you are going somewhere. Let us talk about temperature, because temperature in a 1950s car on a summer road trip was not a background detail. It was the main event. It was the thing you thought about constantly, negotiated with silently, and lost to comprehensively. The vast majority of American cars in the early 1950s didn't have air conditioning. It existed. You could buy it as an option on higher-end vehicles, but it was expensive, it was heavy, it reduced fuel economy, and frankly, most Americans in 1952 had not yet fully accepted the idea that comfort was something a car was supposed to provide. You drove. The car got hot. You rolled down the windows and a hot wind blew in, which was not cool air but was at least moving air, which was better than nothing if you tilted your head just right and squinted against the grit. The physics of the hot car were merciless and consistent. You parked for 30 minutes at a gas station, and the interior temperature climbed to something that a modern thermometer would register with alarm. You got back in and the seat was a griddle. The steering wheel was untouchable for the first 30 seconds. The metal of the door latch could raise a blister. You moved carefully. You distributed the heat cautiously, and you drove with the windows all the way down until the speed of the car created enough airflow to make the situation survivable. Then, in a town, you slowed down, the airflow dropped, and you were hot again. This cycle repeated for the entirety of the trip. Everyone had their system. Dad drove with his left arm out the window, elbow resting on the door, the road wind moving along his forearm in a way that was not cool exactly, but was at least something. Mum kept a cloth dampened with water from the canteen and pressed it to her wrists and her neck, which actually worked, because evaporative cooling is real physics and not wishful thinking. The children pressed their faces directly into the airstream from the window, which their parents regarded with mild anxiety about wind and debris, and which the children regarded as one of the best features of the entire trip. The car thermometer, if you had one, provided numbers that were interesting and completely useless. Knowing it was 104 degrees did not make it 104 degrees less. What it did was give you something to mention to people at the next gas station, a conversational opening that required no other content. Hot enough for you? And they would nod. These strangers at gas stations across the American interior, with the solidarity of people sharing an experience that needed no elaboration. If you had air conditioning, if you were among the fortunate minority whose car had been optioned with it, or whose family had purchased a newer model with it factory installed, this was a thing worth knowing. Other families would notice. You would pull into a gas station with your windows rolled up, which in July was a signal as clear as a flag, and the attendant would acknowledge it, and Dad would mention it with the specific casualness of someone who wants you to know something without appearing to care whether you know it. The air-conditioned car was not just more comfortable. It was, in the 1950s, a status symbol on wheels, proof that you had arrived at a level of prosperity where the weather no longer applied to you in the same way it applied to everyone else, which was, when you thought about it, a very American thing to want. The family dog went on the road trip. This was simply assumed, the way it was assumed that you would bring luggage and children and a thermos. The dog was part of the family, and the family was going on vacation, and therefore the dog was going on vacation. Nobody thought too hard about what this would mean in practical terms. What it meant in practical terms was a medium to large animal sharing the back seat with 2 or 3 children across distances of several hundred miles in a car with no air conditioning in the middle of July. The dog, for its part, was delighted. Dogs are always delighted. The dog found the road trip to be among the finest experiences of its short and enthusiastic life. So many smells, such interesting stops, such a variety of strangers to approach at gas stations. The children found the dog less delightful when it was sitting on them. The dog did not notice this distinction. The dog had no concept of destination. This was both its greatest virtue and its central limitation. It did not understand that there were 500 miles remaining, and that its behaviour over the next 6 hours would significantly affect the quality of that experience for everyone in the vehicle. It understood the window, which it occupied as often as permitted, nose pressed to the gap, ears flattened by the wind, tongue working with aerodynamic enthusiasm against the rushing air. Passing trucks sent it into brief ecstasies of barking. The smell of a cattle operation 3 miles before you could see it prompted a reaction so physical that it required physical management. The dog needed stops, not the same stops the children needed. The dog needed different stops, outdoor stops, stops involving a patch of grass or a telephone pole or a stretch of highway shoulder that offered the olfactory variety a dog required after several hours of car travel. These stops added time. They added them reliably, at intervals that the dog determined unilaterally, communicated through a set of behaviours that became, over the course of the trip, perfectly legible. The restlessness, the pacing across the children, the specific quality of attention directed at the side windows. You learned to read these signs. You stopped. You attached the leash, which the dog tolerated with resignation. You walked a small circle in a gas station parking lot or a roadside pull-out and waited. At motels, the dog was the variable. Some motels accepted dogs without comment, out of genuine hospitality or a pragmatic understanding that people travelling with dogs needed somewhere to stay and were willing to pay for it. Some motels said no pets, which meant a conversation at the office about the nature and size and general character of the dog conducted with the optimistic energy of someone who believes that the right information, delivered in the right tone, might change a posted policy. It sometimes worked. More often it didn't, and you found another motel, and the dog, riding in the back seat through the extended search, remained entirely unaware of the difficulties it was causing. At diners and restaurants, the dog waited in the car, windows cracked, with the philosophical equanimity of a creature that did not understand time, and therefore did not experience waiting in the way that its owners might fear. It was fine when you returned. It was always fine. It was extremely happy to see you, disproportionately happy, as though you'd been gone for years rather than 40 minutes, which was a quality that made every minor inconvenience the dog had caused over the course of the day feel, upon reflection, entirely worth it. In the 1950s, getting lost on a road trip was not an edge case. It was a standard feature of the experience, as reliable as the car getting hot and the children getting bored. You would miss a turn because the sign was small or missing, or pointed at a slightly ambiguous angle. You would follow a road that the map suggested was a shortcut, and discover that it was not a shortcut in any meaningful sense of the word. You would drive for 40 minutes with a growing unease before Dad finally said with great casualness that he thought they might have taken a wrong turn somewhere back there. Mum would unfold the map, which had not been successfully refolded since the trip began, would resist being consulted. The children would ask what was happening. Nobody would give them a satisfying answer. Getting lost had stages, and experienced road trippers recognised them the way sailors recognise the stages of a storm. The first stage was uncertainty, a nagging sense that the landscape looked different from how you expected, that the town you should have passed by now had not appeared. In this stage, Dad might say nothing, or might say something vague about the roads being a little different out here, a sentence that meant exactly nothing and was designed to buy time. Mum might say nothing, or might unfold a corner of the map quietly and study it with an expression carefully calibrated to communicate interest rather than alarm. The second stage was admission. This was harder for some than for others. The admission that you were not where you thought you were was not merely geographical. It was a mild failure of the man who'd been given the map and the wheel, and the responsibility for getting the family from here to there in a reasonable amount of time. Men in the 1950s felt this particular failure quite specifically. They had planned this. They had looked at the map. They had made confident assertions at breakfast about the route. And now they were on a road that seemed to be going in the wrong direction, in a county they had not intended to enter, and the map, in Mum's hands, was not clarifying matters as quickly as everyone would like. The third stage was resolution, which came in one of two ways. Either the map revealed the error and correction was identified, you had missed the turn off 12 miles back, you could turn around or find a parallel road that rejoined the route further on, or you stopped and asked. Stopping and asking required pulling over somewhere that had a person in it, which on a rural highway in the 1950s might mean a gas station, a farmhouse with a truck in the yard, a feed store on the edge of a small town, or a man walking along the road shoulder who turned out to know the area extremely well and had opinions about the best way back to the main highway that were delivered with a thoroughness that was both helpful and time-consuming. The wrong turn cost you an hour, sometimes more. It took you through a town you hadn't planned to see, past a landscape that wasn't on the itinerary, down a road that turned to gravel, and then turned back to blacktop and eventually connected, as all roads eventually connected, to something that led somewhere familiar. And sometimes the wrong turn was better than the right one. The accidental discovery of a stretch of country so beautiful it made the delay feel incidental, a reward delivered sideways by the road, which had been here long before your map and knew a few things you didn't. Stopping to ask for directions was, in the 1950s, a loaded act. Not because people were unwilling to give them, on the contrary. A man at a gas station or a woman on a front porch would give you directions with an enthusiasm and a specificity that was both touching and terrifying. The terror was in the specificity. 1950s directions did not work in miles or minutes. They worked in landmarks, and not necessarily landmarks that still existed. You might be told to drive until you pass the old Miller barn, turn left at the sycamore tree, go about as far as it takes, cross the creek, and then look for the water tower. The barn might be gone, the tree might be gone, the creek might be a dry gully. The water tower, God willing, would still be there. The act of stopping to ask was preceded, always, by a decision that was not made lightly. You did not simply pull over the moment you were uncertain. You drove through the uncertainty for a while first, maintaining the working hypothesis that you were probably fine, that the road would clarify itself, that the sign you needed would appear. This was not stubbornness exactly. It was optimism, the same optimism that had gotten you into the car with a paper map and a destination 600 miles away, and which was one of the defining characteristics of the American road tripper of the era. Eventually the optimism ran out, and you stopped. The best places to ask were gas stations. For the same reason, the gas station attendant was worth talking to about everything else. He knew the roads. He drove them. He sold gas to people who drove them and heard, over the course of each day, a continuous account of road conditions, construction, closed bridges, and wrong turns from people who had just made the same mistakes you were making now. His directions were reliable, practical, and delivered with the specificity of someone who had given them many times before. He might even draw a small map on a paper bag, which was a gesture so helpful and so specific to the era that it deserves its own moment of acknowledgement. Asking a local on the street or in a shop carried more variability. The local knew the area with the deep intuitive knowledge of someone who had never needed to explain it before, who turned left at things without knowing their names, who navigated by feel and familiarity and a set of mental references that existed nowhere except inside their own head. Translating this knowledge into directions usable by a stranger was a creative exercise, and the results ranged from perfectly clear to absolutely mystifying. You might be told to turn at the old Johnson place, not realizing until you were 3 miles past it that you had no idea which place was the old Johnson place or whether it was still standing. You wrote things down. Mum had a small notepad and a pen in her purse, and as the directions were delivered she transcribed them in her careful handwriting, landmark by landmark, turn by turn. This helped. Not always, but usually. You thank the person, you return to the car, you read the notes back once to make sure they made sense, and then you drove. Sometimes you found it. Sometimes you stopped again at the next opportunity and asked someone else. The second person invariably gave slightly different directions, which created a small interpretive challenge in the front seat that was resolved, one way or another, by the road itself, which eventually showed you where you were going, whether you deserved to find it or not. No conversation about the American road trip can sidestep Route 66, the Mother Road, the highway that connected Chicago to Los Angeles across 2,400 miles of America's interior and became, in the 1950s, a kind of rolling mythology. People spoke of Route 66 the way they spoke of destiny. It appeared in songs and novels. It represented freedom, motion, the promise that if you just kept driving, something wonderful was waiting at the end of the continent. It was also, depending on the stretch, narrow, potholed, interrupted by freight trains, and lined with tourist traps of bewildering variety. The romance of the road and the reality of the road existed simultaneously, which is perhaps the most American thing imaginable. The road began in Chicago, in the city, in traffic, and didn't become itself for a while. You pushed through the suburban sprawl of Illinois before the landscape opened into the flat agricultural interior, the cornfields and grain elevators and water, towers of a countryside that was deeply American in the way that things are deeply American when they are enormous and practical and completely indifferent to whether anyone finds them interesting. Missouri came next, and with it the Ozarks, which provided the first real topography of the trip. Hills, curves, forests pressing close to the road, a landscape that required actual attention after the long flat miles before it. Oklahoma arrived with the red dirt and the wide sky that seemed somehow larger here than it did anywhere else, a sky that demanded to be noticed. Texas offered a sliver of the panhandle, flat, wind-scoured, relentless in the way of places that have nothing to hide and no reason to decorate. New Mexico was something else entirely. The colour changed, the earth went red and orange, the mesas appeared on the horizon, and suddenly the road was running through a landscape that looked like nothing in the life you'd come from. Arizona was the desert, serious and hot and stunningly beautiful in the early morning and evening hours when the light hit the canyon walls at angles that made everything look painted. And then California, the descent from the Mojave into the San Bernardino Valley, the sudden appearance of palm trees, the smell of something different in the air, and eventually in Los Angeles, the official end of the road at the Santa Monica Pier, where the Pacific Ocean waited with the complete indifference of something that had been here long before the road and would be here long after. The towns along the route were as much a part of it as the road itself. Amarillo, Flagstaff, Albuquerque, Barstow, each with its own diners, its own motels, its own roadside architecture that had grown up specifically to serve the people moving through. The trading posts selling Navajo jewelry and painted pottery, the petrified wood sold from corrugated tin sheds, the curio shops with their improbable selections of souvenirs. Route 66 was a commercial strip 2,000 miles long, and the people who lived and worked along it had organised their entire economy around the car and the traveller inside it. You were not just a tourist, you were the reason the road existed at all. Somewhere in Kansas or Texas or New Mexico or any of the long empty states that made up the beating interior of the country, there was a sign. It was large, often hand-painted, and it promised something impossible, something that had no business existing in the middle of a highway, but that nonetheless did exist and wanted your attention and $3. The world's largest ball of twine, a two-headed calf, dinosaur bones, a replica of the Eiffel Tower made entirely from car parts, jackalopes for sale. The 1950s roadside attraction was a category of experience unique to American highways, born from the understanding that people driving long distances would stop for almost anything if the sign was big enough and the boredom was deep enough. And the boredom, after 6 hours of flat highway, was always deep enough. The signs began early. The best roadside attractions advertised themselves for miles, sometimes dozens of miles, a countdown of billboards that built anticipation with the confidence of something that knew it had time. Each sign added detail. The first one announced existence. The second added a superlative, largest, oldest, strangest, most remarkable. The third specified the exit, the distance, the cost, the hours. By the time you reached the actual attraction, you'd been thinking about it for 45 minutes and the children had been asking for 30. The decision to stop had been effectively made for you by the process of being aware of the thing, which was the genius of the whole system. What waited at the end of the billboard campaign was wildly variable and reliably worth the stop. Not because it was always what the sign implied, it frequently was not, but because the gap between promise and delivery was itself a kind of entertainment. The world's largest something was usually large, and usually whatever it claimed to be, though the superlative was sometimes optimistic. The dinosaur attraction might be one genuine fossil and 6 plaster reconstructions in a shed. The mystery spot, a building where water appeared to flow uphill and a ball rolled against gravity, was either a genuine localized anomaly or a very clever arrangement of optical illusions, and the proprietor, if asked directly, would smile and say nothing useful. The jackalopes were stuffed rabbits with antlers attached, and they were completely wonderful. The gift shop was mandatory. You did not visit a roadside attraction without passing through the gift shop on the way out, and the gift shop had a logic of its own. Pennants, postcards, small ceramic figures, snow globes containing landscapes that had no snow, refrigerator magnets, keychains, miniature replicas of whatever you had just seen outside. The children wanted everything. They were allowed to choose one thing each, a negotiation that was brief and intense and resulted in 2 items that would be treasured for approximately 72 hours and then become part of the permanent landscape of the car's back seat. You drove away enriched in a way that was difficult to quantify. The attraction itself had been, objectively, ridiculous. A large ball of twine, a plaster brontosaurus, a cave full of formations given names by the guide that required some imagination to see. But you had stopped. You had gotten out of the car. You had stood in the sun and looked at something that existed for no other reason than that someone had decided it should exist here, on this road, for people like you passing through on their way to somewhere else. That spirit, stubborn, entrepreneurial, slightly absurd, was as American as anything you would see at an official national monument, and considerably more fun. Vacations in the 1950s were photographed, and photographing them was itself a small ordeal. The camera was almost certainly a brownie, a Kodak brownie, a compact, boxy little device that used film, because all cameras used film, because digital photography was not even a science fiction concept yet. Film was expensive. Each roll had 12 or 24 exposures, and that was your budget for the trip. You did not take 17 photos of the same sandwich and then delete 15 of them. You thought carefully about each photograph. You posed your family in front of roadside attractions, motels, scenic overlooks and diners, squinting into the sun because the sun was almost always in the wrong direction. You did not know what any of these photos looked like until you got home, sent the film to the drugstore and waited a week. The Brownie was a democratic camera. It was affordable, it was simple, it produced results that ranged from charming to blurry, and it asked almost nothing of its operator except that they point it at the thing they wanted to remember and press the button. No settings, no adjustments, no decisions about aperture or shutter speed. You aimed and you pressed, and the Brownie did the rest, for better or worse, with the cheerful confidence of a device that had no idea what had been in front of it, and would not know until the film was developed. The photographs were composed with the specific aesthetic of the era, which is to say, they were composed with the specific constraints of the era. The sun was behind you or the picture would be dark. Everyone stood facing the camera, squinting slightly. There was usually a large object in the background that was the official reason for the photograph, the canyon, the monument, the motel sign, and the family stood in front of it in a line, shortest to tallest or some other arrangement that the person taking the photo had instructed them to adopt. Dad was usually not in these photographs because Dad was taking them. When the roll was developed, he noticed that Dad appeared in approximately 2 photos from the entire trip, both taken by someone else and both slightly out of focus. The precious nature of each exposure created a specific kind of photography, purposeful and commemorative rather than casual and documentary. You did not photograph the car from the highway when the landscape was beautiful, because that was imprecise and would probably come out blurry. You did not photograph the interior of the diner or the gas station attendant's face or the dog's expression when it stuck its head out the window, all of which would have been magnificent. You photographed the things you were supposed to photograph. The scenic overlook, the family at the scenic overlook, the national park sign, the family at the national park sign. When the photographs came back from the drugstore a week or 2 after the trip, they were reviewed with a mixture of satisfaction and disappointment. The ones that worked were genuinely good. The light on the canyon rim, the children in the motel pool with their eyes wide and their mouths open, the long empty highway stretching away toward a horizon that looked exactly like freedom. The ones that didn't work were blurry or dark or slightly off-center in a way that cropped someone's head. You put them all in an envelope. Some made it into an album. Some went into a shoebox. Decades later, someone would find them and not know the name of the motel or the state or the year, but they would recognize immediately, from the chrome and the light and the particular quality of the summer and the faces, exactly what kind of trip it had been. The 1950s car was a marvel of American engineering and also, on a long road trip in July, a machine under enormous stress doing exactly what you were asking it to do, which was too much. Tires blew, radiators overheated, fan belts snapped with a sound like a gunshot in the otherwise silent highway afternoon. The car did break down, and when it did, you were wherever you were when it happened, which was frequently somewhere extremely inconvenient. You pulled to the shoulder, Dad got out and lifted the hood, the way men in the 1950s always lifted the hood, whether or not they had any idea what they were looking at. There was steam perhaps, there was a smell, there was the rattle of tools from the trunk because you had brought tools, because this was always a possibility and someone had been wise enough to plan for it. The blown tyre was the most common catastrophe and the most manageable. Every driver of the era knew how to change a tyre, because not knowing was not an option. You changed your own tyres on the side of the road because there was no one coming to do it for you. And waiting for someone was a strategy that would work eventually, but not quickly and not comfortably. The jack came out, the lug wrench came out, the spare came out of the trunk, and the process began. On the gravel shoulder with the traffic passing at highway speed 3 feet from your left ear. Children were kept in the car. The dog had opinions. Dad worked without commentary, methodically, the way men worked on cars in that era, and 30 minutes later you were moving again with the spare on and the blown tyre in the trunk, and a plan to find a service station before the end of the day. The overheated radiator was a more serious matter, distinguishable from distance by the column of steam rising from under the hood, with the unmistakable energy of something that had been holding on for too long and had finally given up. You pulled over immediately. You didn't open the radiator cap immediately, because the radiator cap in this condition was a pressurized lid on a vessel of boiling water, and opening it would result in consequences that the first aid kit in the glove compartment was not equipped to address. You waited. The engine cooled. You added water, which you had in a jug in the trunk because you had been warned about this and had listened. Sometimes this was sufficient. Sometimes the underlying problem was more serious and required a mechanic, which meant finding one, which meant either driving carefully to the next town or waiting for someone to stop. People stopped. This is worth saying plainly. In the 1950s, on a highway with a car on the shoulder and a family standing next to it in the heat, people stopped. Not always, but regularly. Strangers with water, with tools, with knowledge, with a tow rope, with the simple willingness to help someone having a bad day on the road. They asked what was wrong, and they helped with what they could, and they didn't expect anything in return, and they drove on. The road had its own community, and the community had its own ethic, and stranded travellers were part of it. You would do the same for someone else further down the road. That was understood without being said. The 1950s road trip happened overwhelmingly in summer. School was out, Dad had his 2 weeks of vacation, the children were available, and the country beckoned. The country in summer, particularly the interior of it, was extraordinarily hot. Not uncomfortably warm, genuinely, comprehensively, aggressively hot in the way that the American Southwest and Midwest in July are hot, which is to say that the air itself felt like something you needed to push through, and the pavement shimmered, and the inside of the car reached temperatures that modern safety standards would consider criminal. You drank water from a canteen. You pressed a wet cloth to your forehead. You drove through the heat the way you drove through everything on a 1950s road trip, steadily, forward, without stopping unless you absolutely had to, because forward was the only direction that made any sense. The heat began before you left the driveway. The car had been sitting in the sun since the night before, and by 8 in the morning it was already warm inside in a way that suggested the afternoon was going to be a serious conversation. You opened all 4 doors before getting in, a ritual that accomplished approximately nothing in terms of actual temperature reduction, but that felt purposeful and therefore necessary. You got in anyway. The seat was already doing what vinyl seats did in summer, which was conducting heat directly and enthusiastically into your legs. You arranged yourself carefully and pulled out of the driveway and drove with the windows fully down and accepted that this was how it was going to be. Crossing the desert was the peak of the experience, and peak is a word being used in its most neutral possible sense. The Mojave, the Sonoran, the high desert of New Mexico, these were places where the heat was not incidental but elemental, where the landscape itself seemed to be made of it, where the horizon shimmered and the road ahead looked wet from a distance and was, upon arrival, completely dry. The vegetation was sparse and low and equipped with thorns, as though the desert had decided that anything soft had no business being here. The road cut through all of it with the straight-line certainty of engineers who had not been interested in going around. You developed a relationship with shade. A tree beside the road, a bridge, the shadow of a cliff face. These were noticed and appreciated in a way that shade is not noticed or appreciated in a temperate climate. When you stopped for gas or water in a desert town, you found the shadow beside the building and stood in it, while the car was attended to, and the difference between sun and shade at 103 degrees was not small. It was the difference between endurable and not endurable, and you stood in it with the specific gratitude of someone who has just been reminded that relief is a real thing. The children were affected by the heat in ways that collapsed the usual distinction between bored and tired. They became a third thing, inert, damp, draped across the back seat with the unself-conscious bonelessness of people who have stopped caring about posture. The dog was similarly horizontal, breathing slowly, occupying the floor with the fatalistic acceptance of a creature that trusted you completely and was, in this particular matter, perhaps too trusting. Everyone was waiting for evening. Evening in the desert arrived with a drop in temperature so sudden and so welcome that it felt personal, as though the day had decided after all to apologize. The air came through the windows, cool and clean, and smelling of something dry and herbal and desert-specific, and the car moved through it, and the stars came out, and the heat became a thing that had happened today and would happen again tomorrow and was in the meantime over. At certain points on the journey, usually where the landscape became dramatic enough that even Dad, who was focused primarily on making time, could not deny that something remarkable was happening, the car would slow and pull to a gravel shoulder, a scenic overlook, a turnout, a wide spot in the road where someone with foresight had installed a low wall and a sign telling you what you were looking at. The Grand Canyon, a mile across and a mile deep, orange and red in the late afternoon sun. The Rockies, snow-capped and indifferent to your schedule. The Pacific coast, impossibly blue and vast and nothing like anything you'd seen growing up in Ohio. You stood at the railing, the wind in your hair, the children briefly miraculously quiet, and you understood for a moment why you'd come, why everyone came, why the road kept calling people west and north and south and further, always further. The scenic overlook had its own etiquette. You parked, you got out, all of you, even the dog on its leash, even the reluctant child who'd been in the middle of something involving the back seat and a book and did not want to be interrupted. You walked to the railing or the low wall or the edge of the gravel where the ground changed from human-maintained to geological, and you looked. This was the whole activity. You looked at the thing. It was very large. You were very small. These two facts, placed in direct relation to each other, produced something that was difficult to name, but that was clearly the point of stopping. The Grand Canyon was the supreme example, the overlook that all other overlooks were practicing for. Nothing prepared you for it. The photographs in the travel brochures had given you information, a large canyon, various colours, quite deep. But information was not the same as standing at the rim and discovering that your brain had no existing category for what it was receiving. It was simply too large to process as a single thing. You looked at it in pieces. The far rim, a blue-grey line in the distance. The river at the bottom, a silver thread that looked nothing like a river of the size it actually was. The layers of rock, red and orange and cream and purple, recording time in a way that made your own timeline feel briefly and instructively insignificant. The Rockies approached differently, gradually, over hours, growing on the horizon from blue suggestions to definite shapes to the full, snow-covered reality of mountains that were genuinely enormous in every direction you looked. The passes were their own experience, the climb, the thin air that you noticed before you identified it, the view from the top where you could see back the way you'd come for what looked like forever. Then the descent, steep and curving, the brakes working seriously, the smell of them faint in the car, the valley below opening up green and wide and waiting. The Pacific Coast Highway, where it existed, offered overlooks so consistently beautiful that stopping for all of them would have added days to the trip, and nobody was going to do that. But you stopped for some, pulled to a turnout above the water, and got out and heard below the wind the sound of the ocean against the rock face far below, a sound so continuous and so old that standing next to it made you feel, briefly and pleasantly, like a minor character in something much larger than your own life. You got back in the car. Dad checked the mileage. The road curved south along the coast, and the view came and went through the turns, offering and withdrawing, teaching you what intermittent beauty does to attention, which is to make it sharper. The road in the 1950s was populated by strangers who had a distinct relationship with each other. Courteous, curious, occasionally competitive, and bound by unspoken rules of highway behaviour that everybody understood and that nobody had written down anywhere. You waved at other drivers on country roads. You flashed your headlights to warn oncoming traffic about a speed trap. You pulled over for a car on the shoulder without being asked. There was a sense of shared enterprise on the highway, a recognition that everyone out there was doing the same difficult, hopeful thing, moving through a large country in a heavy car towards somewhere they wanted to be. Road rage, as a concept, existed, but it was muted. Horns were honked sparingly, and usually with a specific communicative purpose rather than as a general expression of displeasure. The wave was a genuine institution. On two-lane rural roads especially, drivers acknowledged each other as they passed, not always a full wave, sometimes just the lift of 2 fingers from the top of the steering wheel, a minimal gesture that nonetheless communicated everything it needed to communicate. I see you. I recognise this shared situation we're in. Good luck out there. Truckers had their own language of lights and horn patterns that regular drivers could partially decode. A flash of headlights to say you can pull back in after passing. A long horn blast that meant something urgent that you wanted to know. The road had a vernacular, and learning it was part of learning to drive long distances. The competitive element was present but kept within limits. There was a specific dynamic around passing, the calculus of whether you could make it around the car ahead before the oncoming lane closed, the brief acceleration and the tuck back in, and the unspoken acknowledgement between the 2 cars that had just negotiated something together at speed. Nobody liked being passed. Everyone preferred to be passing. The car that sat behind you for 10 miles waiting for its moment was a minor irritant. The driver who took an unreasonable risk to get around you was a subject of commentary in the front seat that the children were not supposed to hear. Trucks were their own category. The 18-wheelers that moved freight across the country on the same roads you were using for vacation occupied a different lane of authority. They were larger. They were slower on hills. They created a wall of wind when you passed them that required a firm grip on the wheel and a moment of committed attention. But truck drivers, as a class, were knowledgeable and generally decent. They knew the roads better than anyone. They knew where the wait stations were, where the construction was, which diners were worth stopping at. If your car was in distress on the shoulder and a truck driver stopped, you were in better hands than with most. The out-of-state license plate was a constant source of information, an occasional mild prejudice. You noted where other drivers were from, formed instantaneous and completely unsupported impressions about their driving habits based on their state of origin, and adjusted your expectations accordingly. Cars from your home state encountered far from home produced a small shock of recognition, a feeling of kinship with strangers that was entirely based on geography and entirely real. You might wave at them with slightly more enthusiasm than you waved at cars from other states. They might wave back the same way. You'd never know what brought them here or where they were going, but for a moment on a highway in the middle of the country, you were from the same place, and that was something. There was a specific anxiety that lived in the back of the mind of every driver travelling through a small town on a 1950s highway, and it was this. The speed limit had just changed from 55 to 25, and you had not seen the sign, and there was a police car parked behind the gas station. The small-town speed trap was a legendary institution of American road travel, spoken of in gas stations and diners and motel lobbies across the country, with a kind of reverent dread usually reserved for weather and illness. Certain towns were known for it. Certain stretches of highway had a reputation. People warned each other. Word travelled. None of this necessarily helped, because the sign was still where it was, and you were still doing 47 through a town whose speed limit dropped without adequate warning. The approach to a small town on a two-lane highway required a particular attentiveness that was easy to neglect after hours of open road. The open road had its own rhythm, a steady speed, a relaxed grip on the wheel, the mile markers coming at intervals that had become predictable and almost meditative. Then the landscape changed. Buildings appeared at the road's edge, a grain elevator, a church steeple, a water tower with the town's name painted on it in letters visible from a mile away. This was the signal. This was the moment to check the speedometer, to watch for the sign that announced the new limit, to begin the deceleration that would have you at an appropriate speed by the time you reached whatever constituted the town centre. The sign was not always where you expected it. It might be set back from the road, partially obscured by a tree that had grown up since the sign was installed. It might be faded, it might be on the right side of the road when you were watching the left. You missed it sometimes, and you carried your highway speed into a town that was operating at a completely different tempo, and the police car behind the gas station, or the grain elevator, or the town hall noted your speed with the patience of something that had been waiting exactly this long for exactly this moment. The traffic stop in a small town was a social encounter with legal consequences. The officer who approached your window was unhurried, polite, and completely unmoved by any of the explanations you were preparing as he walked from his car to yours. You were from out of state, which was apparent from your plate and which did not help. You had not seen the sign, which was possibly true and which was not, in the officer's view, a distinction that changed anything. The speed limit was what it was. Your speed was what it was. The fine was what it was, payable at the courthouse or the police station before you left town, which you would be doing within the hour. You paid it. There was no meaningful alternative. You paid it at a small window in a small building staffed by a person who had also been waiting, if not for you specifically then for someone very much like you, all morning. The receipt was folded and put in the glove compartment. You returned to the car. You pulled out of the town at precisely the posted speed limit, maintained that speed until you were well beyond any possible jurisdiction, and then resumed highway speed with the chastened cautiousness of someone who had just been educated at a cost of $10 or $15 or $20, depending on the town and the degree of the infraction, about the importance of watching for signs on the approach to small towns on two-lane highways in the American interior. In the absence of anything else to listen to, you listened to the radio. The car radio in the 1950s was a fixed unit mounted in the dashboard, tuned by a large knob that swept across the AM dial, and its range was completely at the mercy of geography and distance. In the cities you had options, pop, country, a little bit of the new rock and roll that the teenagers were losing their minds over. On the open highway, you had what you could get, which was sometimes a strong signal from a distant station, and sometimes pure static, and sometimes Thrillingly, a broadcast from somewhere so far away it felt like another country. Late at night, the AM radio did strange things. Signals bounced off the atmosphere. You might pick up a station from 500 miles away, coming in clear and strong in the dark, playing something you'd never heard before, the announcer's voice intimate in the otherwise silent car. The dial was a physical object, a large chrome knob that you turned with your right hand while watching the road, feeling for the sweet spot between the static and the signal, the way you might feel for the edge of something in the dark. The needle moved across the frequency numbers printed on the glass face of the dial, and the sound changed as it moved. A fragment of something, a wash of static, another fragment, and then the lock of a clear signal, the music or the voice coming through steady and full, and you left it there and drove. The music of the early 1950s was everywhere on the dial if you could find a signal strong enough to carry it. Perry Como, Patti Page, whose song about a doggy in the window was one of the most played songs of 1953, and which the children could sing from beginning to end and would, upon request or without it. Hank Williams, whose voice carried a specific American sadness that sounded completely correct coming through a car radio on a dark highway in the middle of the country. Big band music on the stations that had not yet updated their programming. Gospel on Sunday mornings, coming in from stations you couldn't place. The choirs enormous and immediate in the small space of the car. The news came on at the top of every hour, a male voice reading the headlines with the specific authority of someone who'd been trained to sound certain. Korea, in the early years of the decade. Eisenhower. The economy, which was good, which the radio reminded you of with some regularity. The weather, which was relevant and which was delivered in the form of a general forecast for a multi-state region that might or might not include where you actually were. You listened anyway, because the radio was on, and the information was being provided, and there was something companionable about a voice in the car even when it was telling you things you already knew. The static was part of the experience. Not an absence of content, but a presence of its own. The white noise of the American interior, the sound of the electromagnetic spectrum negotiating with geography and distance. Driving through a mountain range scrambled the signal into something that sounded like the radio was distressed. Emerging from the other side, you picked up a new station in a new market playing music calibrated for a different slice of America, and you were briefly inside that world before the signal faded and the dial needed adjusting again. The radio was the voice of wherever you were, changing as you changed, following the road the same way you followed it, one frequency at a time, always moving, never quite the same twice. Every state line was a small ceremony. You crossed it, or rather, you passed a sign that told you that you had crossed it, and there was a moment of collective acknowledgement in the car. You were somewhere new, a different state, different license plates going the other way. Sometimes a rest stop on the other side with a little building where a cheerful representative of whatever tourism board had funded it would give you a pamphlet and, on a good day, a free sample of something local. The children asked if you were there yet. You were not there yet, but you were one state closer, and that mattered. Dad checked the mileage. Mum marked the map. Someone in the back seat asked for a snack. The sign fell away behind you, and the next state began. The signs themselves were modest by the standards of the roadside advertising that surrounded them. No billboards had prepared you for the state line sign the way they had prepared you for the world's largest ball of twine. The sign simply stood at the edge of the road, white or green depending on the state and the era, announcing the name of the place you were entering with the quiet confidence of something that didn't need to sell itself. Welcome to New Mexico, land of enchantment. Welcome to Arizona. Welcome to California, which said nothing else and needed to say nothing else. The physical crossing of the state line was often accompanied by a change in the landscape that was either dramatic or entirely absent, depending on where the line fell. Some state lines split a landscape down the middle. You went from flat to hilly, from dry to green, from one kind of soil to another, because the line had been drawn along a river or a ridge that was itself a genuine boundary between different kinds of country. Other state lines were entirely invisible in the landscape, drawn by surveyors across terrain that had no interest in political geography, and you crossed them without any evidence except the sign, entering a new state that looked exactly like the state you'd just left. The rest area at the state line was an institution of the era, a small building with bathrooms, a water fountain, a table with brochures about the state you'd just entered, and occasionally a person in a uniform or a volunteer whose job was to welcome you and answer questions about roads and attractions and the general character of the state. These people were invariably cheerful, because welcoming travellers was the whole of their job and they had chosen it on purpose. They had opinions about which route you should take, which town had the best diner, which park was worth the detour. They pressed brochures into your hands with genuine enthusiasm. The brochures went in the glove compartment, which was already full of brochures from previous states and the map and the notepad with directions and the receipt from the speed trap and other accumulated documents of the trip in progress. The glove compartment told the story of the journey in paper, a layered archive of everywhere you'd been and everything you'd been advised to see, most of which you had not seen and would not see, but which represented, in aggregate, the enormous generosity of a country that wanted to show you what it had. You were one state closer. The next state's brochures were already in your hands. The road ahead was exactly as long as it had always been, and somehow that was fine. The road trip, in popular memory, is always about the going out, the departure, the adventure, the discovery. Nobody writes songs about the drive home. And yet the drive home was its own experience, different in quality and texture from everything that came before it. The car was heavier on the way back, loaded with souvenirs and laundry and sand from wherever you'd been. The children were quieter, not the bored quiet of the outbound journey, but the depleted quiet of people who'd been fully experienced. Mum and Dad were tired in a particular way that is only possible when you've been on the road for a week and are now reversing every mile of it. The roadside attractions did not beckon the same way. The diners felt familiar rather than exotic. Everyone was thinking, in some background part of their mind, about home, the specific weight and smell and texture of home, the ordinary miracle of sleeping in your own bed. The return trip had a different relationship with time. On the way out, time was something you moved through, each mile taking you further from the familiar and closer to wherever you were. Going, and the going itself was the point. On the way back, time was something you wanted to compress. You had seen the things. You had done the trip. The road between here and home was not an adventure waiting to happen, but a distance to be covered, and the difference between these two framings of the same physical miles was considerable. Dad drove faster on the way home. Not dangerously faster, but with the focused efficiency of someone whose interest in the scenery had been satisfied, and who was now operating in the mode of getting there. The souvenirs revealed themselves in the car as a kind of inventory of the trip, the things you had bought at the attraction, and the roadside stand and the gift shop and the state line rest area, now packed into bags and wedged between suitcases and occupying the spaces that had been empty on the way out. The children guarded their selections, the ceramic roadrunner from New Mexico, the pennant from the national park, the polished piece of petrified wood that had seemed absolutely essential to own at the moment of purchase and that would sit on a shelf for decades. These objects were the trip made portable, the evidence that it had happened, the thing you'd have to show for it when people asked. The familiar landmarks appeared in a reverse order, and they felt different coming from this direction. The water tower of a town you'd passed 3 days ago now meant you were close to home rather than far from it. The stretch of highway you'd found frustrating on the way out, the construction, the slow truck you'd been unable to pass, was now simply part of the landscape of return, a marker you drove through without the urgency of someone who had somewhere to be. The last 100 miles were always the longest in the way that last miles are longest, when the destination is close enough to feel it and far enough to require patience. The driveway, the familiar particulars of your own street, the neighbour's maple, the mailbox, the crack in the sidewalk that had been there since before the children could walk, the car in the driveway and the engine off, and the silence after days of engine noise and wind and radio. Everyone sat in the car for a moment before getting out, not quite ready to be home yet, still partly on the road, still in the other America that existed between departures and arrivals. Then someone opened a door, and the dog jumped out, and the spell broke, and you were home. Here is the thing about the 1950s road trip that can get lost in all the heat, and the car trouble, and the children asking when they'd arrive. It was, at its core, an act of extraordinary optimism. To pack your family into a car with a paper map and a cooler of sandwiches and point yourself at the horizon was to believe, genuinely and without irony, that the country on the other side of your driveway was worth seeing, that the road would hold, that the car would run, that something good was waiting at the end of the day. Americans in the 1950s had survived the Depression and a world war, and they were done sitting still. The highway was new, the country was vast, and somewhere out there, past the gas stations and the motels and the tourist traps and the towns too small to name, was America itself, wide and strange and full of things no one had yet photographed or written down. They went to find it. They always went to find it. And even when they got lost, even when the car broke down, even when the motel had no vacancy and the diner was closed and the map was useless, even then they were exactly where they were supposed to be. The post-war prosperity that made the road trip possible was itself a kind of astonishment. 20 years before, families had not driven cross-country on vacation because there had been no money for vacations, no money for gas, and in many cases no car in a condition to attempt it. Now there was money. There was a car in the driveway that started reliably. There was a 2-week vacation from a job that paid enough to fund the trip. And there was a country full of roads leading away in every direction. The act of going was a celebration of having arrived somewhere, not a destination on a map, but a moment in American life when the future felt accessible, when the road was an expression of possibility rather than necessity. The children who rode in those back seats grew up to become the people who remembered the road trips their whole lives, who could recall, decades later, the specific quality of light over the canyon rim, the smell of the diner in the morning, the sound of the radio fading in and out on a dark highway in Kansas. Memory is selective, and what it kept from those trips was not the heat or the arguments or the hours of boredom, but the moments that broke through all of that and were simply, purely good. The ice cream at the roadside stand, the stars above the campsite, the morning they woke up in a motel and realized they were 200 miles from the Pacific Ocean, and nothing was stopping them from getting there. The road trip was also, in ways that were not always articulated but were deeply felt, an act of claiming. You drove through your own country, and it was enormous and various and sometimes baffling and sometimes heartbreakingly beautiful, and the driving of it made it yours in a way that maps and photographs and other people's accounts could not. You had been there. You had stood at the rim and seen the river a mile below. You had eaten the peach from the roadside stand in Georgia and watched the sun go down over the Pacific and woken up in a motel in New Mexico with the desert outside the window and coffee from a thermos and 500 miles to go. You had done all of this in a car you'd loaded yourself, with people you loved, on roads that were sometimes terrible and sometimes sublime, and always, always going somewhere. That is what the 1950s road trip was underneath all the chrome and the vinyl and the paper maps and the hot summer miles. It was faith. Faith in the road, in the country, in the proposition that getting in the car and going was worth whatever happened along the way. They believed it absolutely. Those families who pulled out of their driveways in the summer of 1952 or 55 or 58 pointed the car at the horizon and drove. Looking back now, through everything that came after, it is difficult not to believe it with them. And so ends your road trip through the summer of 1954. You made it. You and your chrome-plated chariot and your incorrectly folded map and your cooler full of lukewarm Coca-Cola and your dog, who was wonderful about the whole thing even when nobody else was. You survived the heat and the blown tyre outside of Amarillo and the speed trap in that little town whose name you never caught because you were going 47 through a 25 zone and had other things on your mind. You ate pie in 9 different states. You asked for directions 4 times and got lost 3 of them. You found a vacancy sign glowing green in the dark when you needed it most, and you slept in beds that were exactly adequate and woke up ready to do it again. You saw America. Not the America of textbooks or newsreels or the neighbour's vacation slides, the real one. The one that exists between the cities, in the long flat miles and the small towns and the roadside stands and the diners where the coffee was always hot and the waitress always called you honey and the pie was always worth ordering even when you'd already said you wouldn't. You saw it through a windshield going 60 miles an hour with the windows down and the radio fading in and out across the dial, and it was enormous and various and strange and yours. The people who took these trips were not remarkable people. They were ordinary Americans, the kind who went to work and came home and raised their children in modest houses on modest streets and saved all year for 2 weeks in July. What was remarkable was what they did with those 2 weeks. They loaded everything they owned into a car and drove across the country on roads that were still being finished and stopped at places that had no reason to exist except that the road ran past them and they found it worthwhile. They found all of it worthwhile, the heat and the wrong turns and the children in the back seat and the dog and the motel rooms and the state line signs and the 60-cent diners and the scenic overlooks where they stood at the railing and looked at something so large it made them briefly and pleasantly small. There is something in that which deserves a quiet moment of acknowledgement. Those families didn't have GPS or air conditioning or internet reservations, or any of the infrastructure that makes modern travel feel like a managed experience. What they had was a map, a tank of gas, and a genuine belief that the country on the other side of the driveway was worth seeing. And they were right. They were completely right. So tonight, as you settle into whatever comfortable arrangement you have made for yourself, your pillow, your blanket, your temperature-controlled room with its indoor plumbing and its quiet and its complete absence of vinyl seats, conducting heat into your legs, take a moment to appreciate the distance between here and there. Between the motel with its one thin bar of wrapped soap and the bed you're in right now. Between the lukewarm Coca-Cola from the cooler that was mostly water by day 3 and whatever is on your nightstand. Those travellers are gone now, most of them. The roads they drove have been widened and bypassed and replaced. The diners are closed or changed. The motels have been torn down or absorbed into chains that offer consistency in place of character. The gas station attendant who checked your oil and cleaned your windows and drew you a map on a paper bag is a memory so specific to its era that it requires explanation to anyone who didn't live it. But the road is still there. Not the same road, not the same country, not the same summer. But the impulse is the same, the ancient American restlessness, the belief that somewhere ahead of you is something worth the drive. It was true in 1954. It is still true tonight. Rest now. The road will be there in the morning, and wherever you are going, it is worth the trip. Good night.